So the last portion of this chapter deals with clinical issues that are related to operant conditioning and some of the principles associated with it. So we've talked about differences between wanting and liking, that there appear to be different pathways in the brain that are involved with each of these. And in essence, they tend to combine in order to enhance learning and enhance how reinforcing something is for us. Now, this is a very important aspect of being a live organism, because this sort of system means that we are essentially built to try and find and get whatever it is that we need in order to survive, and at the same time avoid things that might, well, potentially kill us. So we're going to talk about a couple of interesting issues, one of which deals with the fact that if you think about things like high-fat foods, and why is it that we as humans, well, rats as well, really like to eat those kinds of foods? If you think about it from more of an evolutionary perspective and how humans would tend to go through periods of famine and having lots of food available, one of the things that has happened over time is that our bodies have developed systems that tend to encourage us and provide us with a reinforcement for consuming high-fat foods. Why? Because they are calorically dense. And if it was uncertain if in the future food was going to be scarce, you wanted to make sure that when it wasn't scarce, that you consumed as much as possible, stored it away as fat reserves, because inevitably you would run into a point in time where you wouldn't be able to find food easily. Now, we're also going to talk about drug addiction a little bit, because these very mechanisms that have developed to help us survive can go awry. And drug addiction is a prime example of that situation. Now, there's a distinction between, say, someone who has to have their caffeine, otherwise they turn into seriously grouchy individuals. How does something like that differ from an individual who has an addiction? Well, drinking coffee, needing that caffeine, which again can contribute to things like withdrawal if you don't have it, or craving it when you don't have it. That situation is not necessarily going to interfere with their ability to keep a job, maintain relationships, etc. In contrast, there are situations where a drug becomes addictive to the point where it is pathological. In other words, it becomes something that we have to have and we will work to get it regardless of what the potential costs are. And in the case of a pathological addiction, the costs are typically that you lose your job, relationships, your house, and potentially your health, or life for that matter. Now, one of the things that supports addiction, if you think about the way that this system is set up in order for us to experience a reinforced or rewarding type of sensation when we consume something that is good for us, is that with addiction, you're seeking a high. You're seeking that euphoria. And by the way, that euphoric feeling that is experienced with some drugs, and typically usually early on in the use of the drugs, is due to activation of the opioid system in the brain. And of course, having activation of both the dopamine and the opioid system could be a recipe to potentially develop into something that becomes very, very difficult for the individual, or the rat for that matter, to control and stop engaging in whatever that behavior is. So again, many drugs, and in fact, by the way, the drugs that do affect the opioid systems in the brain do interact with dopamine pathways as well. So you basically have this sort of double whammy with some drugs where they are hitting both of these systems. One good example would be things like some of the very strong painkillers, like Oxycontin, that if someone takes the correct amount, it works to relieve pain, which is the opiate system. Now, if you take more than that, then not only does it activate that system, but it also starts to recruit these dopaminergic pathways. So you get this euphoric feeling that ends up being fairly reinforcing to an individual and can put them on a potential path to develop an addiction to that drug, where they will do whatever they need to try and get their hands on it, to try and get that high that they were experiencing. If they don't have it, they can experience rather uncomfortable withdrawal types of responses, and likewise, when they don't have it, they'll crave it. They'll become preoccupied with it. They will want to do whatever, which again could push them to wanting to get their hands on it. Now, when it comes to the effects of many of these drugs, we are usually talking about changes in the amount of neurotransmitter that is available to bind with the postsynaptic receptors. So if we look at this little axon terminal from a dopamine releasing neuron, we have vesicles that contain dopamine, and so when an action potential fires, these vesicles release dopamine out into this synaptic cleft, the space between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neurons. On the postsynaptic side, you have receptors that have binding sites for dopamine. Now, under the dopamine's released, it interacts with its receptors, and then either it is broken down via enzymes, or it is taken back up into the presynaptic terminal. Now, with something like amphetamine and cocaine, this synapse is essentially where the changes are happening that result in an enhancement in dopamine activity. So they have different mechanisms by which this is accomplished. Amphetamine will increase release. So it will actually cause the terminal to start pumping out more dopamine into the synapse. More dopamine means more opportunities for dopamine to interact with the postsynaptic neuron, and it enhances essentially the activity. Something like cocaine, what it does is it prevents the reuptake. So it'll basically park itself in the proteins that are involved with pulling dopamine back out of the synapse into the presynaptic terminal. Again, the result is the same. You have more dopamine out there for a longer period of time to interact with these receptors, and you have a much stronger dopamine signaling here. So in terms of understanding what contributes to drug addiction, in the previous chapter we talked about some of the classical conditioning aspects that are associated with drug addiction. From the point of view of operant conditioning and how it's involved, well, you think about the high that's associated with it. It's pleasurable. There's positive reinforcement. If you don't take it and you start to feel uncomfortable withdrawal effects that then essentially motivate you to take it, and when you take it the withdrawal symptoms go away, that's a negative reinforcement. And of course we have the issue with regard to cravings. So basically what ends up happening is there's some sort of malfunction that happens with these systems in the brain, in particular the dopamine pathways, the reward pathways. Now, at the same time, one of the things that can be really difficult to deal with is the fact that there's no way to determine whether or not someone will develop an addiction to a substance or not, because there are a lot of factors that contribute to this. Anything from genetics to environment that will play a role. So it's rather difficult to pinpoint who might become addicted to a substance or might be more prone to. Now, mind you, we do have some data that indicates that there may be a higher risk factor associated with perhaps having individuals in the family that have already experienced this kind of problem, but it still boils down to the individual and how they handle it. So it also means at the same time that how easily they could let it go varies as well. And at the same time, difficult to know exactly what the mechanisms are that contribute to the fact that somebody could, you may have one person who may engage in taking a particular drug and might even take it to excess, but if they stop doing it, they don't experience the cravings, they may not even experience withdrawal. So again, why is that the case? Lots of questions here, which is why the area of trying to understand the neurobiology, the genetics, and so on that are related to developing a drug addiction, that research area is very, very active. Okay, so it's rather easy to look at things like drugs and how they may impact communication between neurons in the brain. Well, another interesting feature here about this system is that behaviors can also become addictive. So again, when you engage in the behavior, it produces this sort of euphoria, which feels good. If you don't engage in the behavior, you develop cravings, and if you can't engage in the behavior, you experience withdrawal symptoms. And again, these very much resemble what you would see with somebody who has, a physical drug addiction going on. And there have been a number of behaviors that have been identified as behaviors that can potentially turn into behavioral addictions. Gambling is one of these that has received a lot of attention because some individuals can take 20 bucks, go to the casino, play the slots, whatever, and walk away when the 20 bucks is gone or whatever, or they're up. Other people end up with this situation where they get this rather strong reinforcement when they win. And one of the things that I think I mentioned when we were talking about the different reinforcement schedules with gambling, something like gambling, the reinforcement schedule is variable ratio. So you never know which time it will be that you will hit it big. And that schedule has the highest rate of responding, and it is also the hardest one to extinguish. So you've got kind of a double whammy there. And then if you have somebody who has characteristics, again, problems or the reward pathways, the pathways involved with liking are not quite functioning the way that they should in terms of there's a level to which you should be responding, and at some point you should be able to sort of turn that off. If something goes awry here, then you could essentially see the same sorts of issues, and they have seen the same sorts of differences in terms of the brain and the different pathways that seem to be affected in behavioral addictions as they see with actual drug addictions. So, again, you set these systems off regardless of how it's done, and if things go awry, then you end up with problematic situations where these kinds of addictions end up interfering with the person's ability to function normally. Now, as far as treatment for addiction goes, much of it involves aspects of cognitive therapy. So, again, trying to think about your thought process that's going on. In some cases, it may be necessary to complement that with a medical treatment of some sort. Talk about naltrexone, Suboxone for certain kinds of addictions, to say hydrocodone, to perhaps wean them off of it. And at the same time, they're also finding that if we tap into some of these principles, these I guess universal rules that go along with operant conditioning, that you could also use behavior as a way to help treat that addiction. And we actually talked about a couple of these in terms of differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. So you pick something else that you reinforce the individual for, or learning about delaying reinforcement, because one of the things with delaying reinforcement is you get that discounting that happens. So perhaps you can enhance the ability for the person to wait for a better reward or better outcome, as opposed to going for the quick fix, per se. Now, as far as what approaches seem to be most effective, combining cognitive and behavioral. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term CBT, and that potentially, in combination with medication, when there's a serious problem. Again, these seem to be the optimal approach, attacking this or trying to deal with this at different levels by understanding how the addiction gets established in the first place and what can be done to try and weaken that conditioning. All right, so that is a wrap up of the material for Chapter 5.